Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Eileen. I am here today to talk about improving user experience. Not for the people who are visiting your site, but actually for the people who are building your site. And I'm going to start by telling you a story, and just, if it starts to sound familiar, just like nod along, like, yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. So it goes something like this. You start by launching a new site, or maybe a new section of your site, and everything looks awesome. So the article titles are just the right length, and the events in the calendar have all of the relevant information. Teasers are teasing, birds are singing, everything is like just pretty darn good. And then 3 weeks pass. You click over a page, you see something like this. Or maybe you click over to something else and you've designed a hero image that looks like this, and then someone has created a new one that looks like this. Or you open your site up on a phone and you see the information being fed through like an API or through a different channel, and you start to see stuff like this. And the question that is rolling through your mind, like pretty fundamentally, is just why are you breaking my site, people? Like, I worked hard to make this site elegant and responsive and performant, and you authors, you site admins, you're just getting your grubby little paws all over it. So why is that? Like, what's the deal here? Why is it so hard to create good new content for a site? So when it's time for someone on your site to create a new post or to update the information on the homepage, let's take a look. Like, what kind of stuff are they dealing with? Oh, hey, that can't be right? I'm sure that no one here works on a site where your authors are actually expected to work in code, right? We wouldn't do that to them. Certainly not code like this. Oh. Yeah, that's better. That's way better. That's going to be way easier for them to use. My favorite thing about putting new content in a site is definitely the part where I time travel back to 1996. But Eileen, you say, we are a modern website. My authors don't write code. We have a CMS. So, all right. So when the first CMSs came along, this kind of interface, this was pretty snazzy. I mean, look at this. You got some fields. You got some radio buttons. And look at all the formatting choices in that editor. There's bold, there's underline, there's font family, because you totally want authors to be controlling that. You got binoculars for bird watching. There's a purple horseshoe in there. You are set. Like, look at all the stuff your authors can do. But Eileen, you say, Joomla 1.5, that came out in 2008. We're not using that. Our modern CMS experience is much nicer. Oh, all right. Here's the current version of WordPress. Super different. I noticed that we've lost the bird watching, but we still have the purple horseshoe. Here's Sitecore. Okay. Adobe Experience Manager. Sorry. Expression Engine. Also very different. Oh, look. Okay, so here's Drupal. Wow. Really unique. Really different experience. Seriously, you guys, like, what the hell? On the front end, we have gone all the way in the last chunk of years from like Web 2.0 shiny plastic bubble buttons to like skeuomorphism, photorealism, all the way to like touchscreen sort of digital native, super flat design. And on the back end, we've advanced to what, to modal windows? This is super, super unfair. So I have a theory. I think that these two things are connected. I think that our authors are doing a really bad job at this because we're doing a bad job at this. We talk about user-centered design, but the people on the back end use the site more than any visitor. And how many testing sessions do we do with the authoring experience with them? How many iterations and sprints are dedicated to improving this monstrosity? So I want to talk to you today about improving the authoring experience. This is a huge topic, it's really broad, and so I'm just going to explore one narrow slice of it, which is writing content guidelines. So what are content guidelines? Any sort of content creation that happens on your site, blog posts, event listings, service offerings, product pages, every field in that content has its own set of requirements, right? You've got ideal format, you've got voice and tone information, there's length, there's underlying message, there's intended audience. It's a lot to remember. And in fact, it's actually too much for a normal person to remember in the midst of all of the tasks that they're doing. And so content guidelines are the ways that we attach reminders and help to each field, to each section, and to each kind of content so that the authors can do their job well. So we're going to write content guidelines. It's important that we understand who's going to use them. And so when I talk about building content guidelines for authors, who am I talking about? Maybe you work at a big organization and you have a dedicated web team. So there are writers whose job is like specifically full-time creating and managing content for the web. Those are authors. Maybe you work at an organization that doesn't have a dedicated web team, and people from all over deal with the content on your site. Like there's a university that has like food service departments and financial aid and psychology, and those 3 departments each manage their own section of the site. And it's not a person's full-time job, it's just something that they have to do maybe once a month or maybe even once a quarter or once a year. Those people in each separate department, they are authors. And then there's you. Maybe you're an author. This one is sometimes the hardest sell because you're like, why would I bother documenting something that I do literally every day? So there's 2 reasons. One is that you might go out kayaking tomorrow and get eaten by Champy, and then no one will know how to do your job. Do people not from Burlington know about Champy? Champy, also known as Champ. Champ's the lake monster, lives out in the lake, cousin of the Loch Ness monster, possibly the world's last surviving plesiosaur, possibly a large piece of driftwood. Who can say, really? Either way, frankly, it's going to mess up your kayaking trip. The other reason to write instructions for yourself is that you're not doing this for like now you or for tomorrow you. You're doing this for Friday afternoon, 3 months from now, coming down with a cold you, and you only create press releases like every 5 months and you don't remember what size the picture is supposed to be. You just want to go home. So the label author covers a lot of people, all the way from professional full-time content authors down to like occasional casual editors. And it's pretty obvious why a casual editor or an occasional editor would use an extra reminder or like help text. But even professional writers get distracted and have bad days, or they're working on 4 different projects at once. And everyone finds well-written help text useful. The very first step to building good content guidelines is to figure out how to structure your content. So you have to build a content model. So what's a content model? Structured content and content models are kind of buzzwords right now. Content model is a breakdown of the content types and relationships on your site. Notice that I didn't say the content on your site, but the content types. We're not actually looking at what we say, but we're looking for the patterns in how we say it. So structured content is what you get when you take a content type and you break it down into its component parts. I'll give you an easy example. This is a recipe. It is in fact federally mandated. I am not allowed to talk about structured content without using a recipe as an example. So if you look at a bunch of recipes in a row, you start to see some patterns. Like there's the name of the person who wrote the recipe. There's the title of the recipe. This is a legit delicious ginger cake recipe from Epicurious and David Leibovitz. You get the original publication date, maybe what magazine it was originally published in. Then we have a description of this cake, number of servings. It says 8 to 12, a lie. Like 4 to 6 if you eat it for breakfast the next morning, maybe. Then you start to have the ingredient list. And then we have instructions. And you'll notice that the instructions, if you think about like baking recipes, they actually have patterns within them as well. Sometimes we hit something that looks like long form sentence text and we say, okay, that's it. That's as far as we can structure, is to those paragraphs. But actually there's patterns within this. Baking recipes almost always have a preheat for the oven. They've got pan size and pan preparation. There's usually like a garnish or a finishing touch at the end. So there are patterns even within this long form content. And then finally, at the end of this recipe, we've got metadata. Metadata is information about the content rather than of the content. So for recipes, you might have breakfast, lunch, dinner. You might have cuisine, like whether it's Mexican or Turkish or Vietnamese, beginner, intermediate, expert. You might even have editorial things like one-pot meals or freezes well, good leftovers, things like that. This recipe has the metadata of good for both fall and Mother's Day, which I like. It's a year-round cake. And so figuring out your content model is actually just a matter of looking at a bunch of your content, or like a good sort of chunk sample of your content, and then just teasing out the repeating patterns. Okay, so that sounds like a lot of work. Like, why are we bothering to do that? Why are we building a content model at all? Content models help you create consistent content, because if you show someone a big blank box and you say, okay, put all the event information in there, or put the recipe in there, well, good luck maintaining that down the line. But if instead you show them a form and you ask for each piece of information in a separate field, and each field has its own reminders for what kind of information needs to be captured, what the voice is, what the format is, now we're actually getting somewhere. Writing content guidelines for a big box like this is basically impossible. But writing a bunch of little content guidelines for content that's been broken down, that's much more reasonable. So, okay, so we're going to write some help text. When it comes to writing help text, we have to find a middle point. We have to provide enough information that the authors know what we need from them in the content, but we can't put 3 paragraphs of information for every single text field because they just won't read it. And so I'm going to go over a bunch of categories of information that are the kinds of things you might want to cover in your help text. The very first thing, this is not a category at all, this is like a super category, is names. So what is this thing? Is it a recipe? Is it a biography? Is it a news event? And a description for the content type is incredibly helpful. This helps people figure out things like, should this be a news entry or a blog post? Does this information belong under events or under lectures? This is especially helpful if you are moving from a system where everything was in a single content type, like everything was entered as a new entry or a new page, and you're moving into a separation of those things. You have to give people the questions and the tools, almost like a little flow chart of, okay, what goes where? How do I figure out when I have this piece of content what content type it should end up in the new world order? And then lastly, we've got field names. It can feel a little redundant, but replacing the generic field names like title and body in a CMS with things like event name and event description, they help give the author a sense of place. It helps orient them, give them context, and it just helps them remind them which content belongs where. So editorial questions. This is what we're saying and how we're saying it. So voice and tone, of course, is a huge thing. Words that people should or shouldn't use. Underlying messages, if you have a message architecture or like a strong mission statement that you want to be communicating in the content, it helps to remind people of that. Intended audience is a big thing, right? If a page, especially if you have subject matter experts and people who work within your organization, they're so used to their own acronyms and our own program names and things, it doesn't really occur to us that like outside people don't actually understand what we mean. This is all meaningless jargon to them. And so if the intended audience for this content is someone who's not a deep insider in your organization, we have to remember to spell out our acronyms and to not use the words that are sort of industry insider. Grammar reminders, like especially if you have like captions and things like that on your images, should this be a question? Should it be a declaration? Should it start with an action word? And then there's information that must or must not be included. Again, if this is something where you used to put everything in one field and now you're separating stuff out, it can be really helpful to remind people, okay, don't put join us on July 3rd in the body because the date now has its own field. It's being pulled out and we can do interesting things with display and put it in the calendar. And so don't repeat the date in the description. This is also a really nice place for voice and tone and for like style guide things if you can link to them, right? Because they're usually like a big separate sort of behemoth on your intranet or in a PDF. And if you can link to them so that people don't have to remember to dig them up, that's really nice. Format. So where editorial was like, what are we saying? This is more like, how is what we are saying shaped? So there's field length. And some CMSs, lots of CMSs, can do max field length. Not all of them can do minimum field length. And field length is also really, if you're like enforcing it with JavaScript, it's very fixed, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that the ideal field length isn't something else. You might say 200 characters max, but ideally stick to 140 if you can. Data format. If you've got something like measurements, should it be in centimeters? Should it be in inches? Are we rounding up? How many decimal places are we using? Just all the kinds of things about sort of the format of the information so that it's consistent between entries. And this is a place where an example can be really good. So you can say in your help text, like, and then give an example of the perfect kind of formatting. If a field uses HTML, which kinds of tags are being accepted? I have worked with a client who has a big, they have a big WYSIWYG box that the people type things in, and then they save it, and they can make it anything in that WYSIWYG box. That editor's got the font family choices, and they can make it pink and underlined and bold, and then they save it, and it shows up on the website in black and white text with like the bare minimum of formatting. And people call the QA IT department, and they're like, what happened? Where'd my pink sparkles go? Like, those fields aren't actually being accepted. And so, I mean, ideally you should change your editor so people can't do that. But also, just if you're accepting HTML, tell them what they can and can't do. And then for a checkbox or select list, how many selections are allowed? This is, again, something that your CMS can enforce. But sometimes the fact that you technically would allow up to 10 still means that you might actually really only want 2 or 3, and that the 10 is sort of an edge case. And so remind people that you only want 2 or 3 categories. Images. This is a really big one for anyone who works in design and who is used to people taking your beautifully, perfectly curated image and replacing it with like a stock photo of those happy European people in a business room. Image file format is one thing that's like, you know, PNGs versus TIFFs versus JPEGs, whatever. Shape and size, whether, especially this is big for hero images. We have all these spaces now on the web where we want like a really long, narrow image, and it is hard to find something that looks like good in a short landscape across the entire page. Where and how the image will be used. So if it's going to be shrunk down to a thumbnail, that sort of means different things for what you might want in the image than if you're going to always use it full screen. And then art direction. This is a huge thing. So like, do you need a dark left-hand side because there's going to be white text overlaid? Is it going to be, is it supposed to be a panoramic landscape, or is it supposed to be like a macro picture of food? Because if you designed for one and then people just swap it out for the other, it's weird. It changes the mood of the page. If it's people, is it an action shot? Are they breaking the fourth wall? Are they, you know, are they sitting at a desk? Is it supposed to be internal people, like people working at the company, or should it be a photo of clients? Like, what's the point of this picture? And then finally, we've got display. Does this field control where something will be displayed? So this is a big thing. We often have that little checkbox that's like promote to the front page, but there's a lot of complex programmatic stuff going on with taxonomy nowadays and tags. And so if you put something in a category, that might mean that it shows up in the sidebar on some page, or it might mean it shows up in the related events, or the you might also like on a product page. And people need to understand that that's what the categories are doing for them, or tags. If the contents of the field are going to be displayed alongside other information or not displayed alongside, if you have like a short version and a long version of a teaser, is it okay for them to say almost the same thing because they're never going to be displayed alongside one another? Or if your detail page design actually ends up with them displaying one on top of the other, it'll be really weird for them to be repetitive of each other. This is the kind of stuff that's like, you designed for it and you make this interface, and it's fine, right? Like, it works great, but then if people don't understand that that's what's happening moving forward, if they don't understand where the fields are going, then you just end up with odd use cases, and it makes you sad. Okay, so that's a ton of information that you might fold into your content guidelines. So where does that all come from? Who do you have to talk to get all of this information? So designers are an incredible source of information here. Designers often have a piece of a design that they're very protective of. They're like, okay, look, this section over here, it is not going to look good when this title gets too long. If you don't pick an image that has like a bright blue overtone, the whole page is going to fall apart. So that kind of stuff you want to find out so you can put in the guidelines. Similarly, the developers, the people who are actually building out the features on the site, you often get to a point as a developer where you're like, does anyone besides me actually understand how these categories make the related events show up in the sidebar? And the answer, of course, is that no. No one besides you understands. And so you need to share it so that it can be written into the guidelines so that other people can understand how the site works. Marketing, of course, has a lot to say about the editorial aspects of any kind of content. They've got branding, messages, they got keywords and phrases they want to be worked in, they have all that kind of stuff. The content team, if you have one, which might only be like one person, depending on the size of your organization, they have a lot of information tied up in generic job knowledge. And this can actually be some of the hardest kind of information to get out because they don't even realize how much they know. It's just sort of like this is how they do their job. And the best luck I've actually had has been shadowing a content person, just sitting with them for a while and watching them do their job. Because you'll just sort of sit and they'll say, okay, here's how I create a new entry. And they'll be doing things that you understand. And then they'll like flip over to some spreadsheet and copy something. And you're like, whoa, what? What just happened there? What did you just do? And they're like, oh, there's the manufacturer's spreadsheet on the Z drive. That's where we get this information. And you're like, I didn't know we had a Z drive. Everyone has a Z drive, but that kind of stuff is like, it's so built into their everyday that they don't even understand that other people don't know it, so that you can sort of write it down and share it. And then finally, if you work in an organization that has like a formal QA team or customer service, they are great sources of information about habitual problems. You probably know about like the larger sort of fundamental problems on your site, but the little things where like, oh yeah, people call all the time asking about shipping dimensions because we only include that on half of our product listings. That kind of stuff, customer service and QA, they fix those problems without telling people about it often. That's what their job is to fix the little problems. And so they take care of a lot of minor issues that you could fix if you just sort of planned ahead for them a little bit. And so as you're gathering these guidelines, you actually need to talk them through with the people who are going to use them. And if you take nothing else away from this, take this, that you cannot build things by yourself. If you're creating a tool for someone else to use, and these content guidelines are a tool for the authors to use, you have to build it with them and not for them. See if you can avoid like the big reveal, where you build something really big and then you unveil it when it's finished. Because it feels really crappy that it turns out like you unveil this thing and it's like not quite what they needed. And you're like, I just spent weeks and weeks on this, and you unveil the curtain and there's these beautiful content guidelines and they're like, okay, thanks. So to be clear, if this is not part of your work culture already, sharing like drafts in progress, it is terrifying to share things in draft format and to share things that are half done, because you're like, I don't think this is good yet. Like, don't think that I think that this is a good idea. It's scary putting something out there and you know that it's not polished and it's not like sort of up to snuff. That's terrifying. But the ability to adapt and adjust is worth it. And so if this is not part of your workplace culture already, like, you can start to introduce it a little bit. Like, the fear of sharing imperfect works in progress, it is a valid fear, it is a true fear, but it is a fear that is holding you back from doing your best work. Okay, so content guidelines. I like them all. You guys are like starting to come around, right? You like the content guidelines idea. So, okay, so you're gonna go back to work like next week, and you're going to spend a bunch of time, you're going to start gathering information from people, and you're going to have all these notes, and you're going to like have a really solid start. So how do you get that information from your notes and from sort of the, Word document of your soul into author brains? So maybe you're like, yeah, we already do this, Eileen. We make content guidelines, we write those, we put those in a PDF training document. And I get it, PDFs are easy. Like, the pros for PDFs is that they're easy, really, they are. And you get tons of formatting control, and you need no development resources to create a PDF. You just put in a thing, and then you export as PDF. It's great. Here's the problem with PDFs. No one reads them. Sorry, spoiler alert, no one reads them. It kind of belies the whole point. Like, they literally might open them for like 2 seconds when they get the email the first time, and then they archive that sucker, and they never open it again. So we all have that appliance in our houses that has some button that you have no idea what it is. I have a button on my microwave. It's a cursive Q and the number 3. I don't know. I'm not going to press it. Good Lord. I could look it up, but I don't keep the manual with the microwave. And so your authors are the same way, right? If the manual is in a separate file, it's not there when they are writing things in the Word doc, in the Google doc, in whatever. chances are really low that they're going to go like open it and study it and peruse it before they start their work. And I feel your pain here. They should have bookmarked that document. They should have printed it out and like framed it and lovingly taped it to their monitors. They should have made like a laminated wallet-sized version and carried it everywhere. But since they refused to take those perfectly reasonable steps, we have to change our tactics. So here's a radical idea. If the content is being entered on a CMS form, the guidelines should also live on that CMS form. So the pros here is that the big one is the information is shown right where it's needed. No one ever has to choose to seek out the guidelines. No one can ever use the fact that they didn't see the guidelines as an excuse. I like that. Because the instructions are right next to the fields, that means that your fields can be reorganized in whatever way makes content creation easiest. So maybe you group similar fields together, right? You've got the short version and the medium description, or the short description and the medium description and the long description all in one little cluster of fields. Maybe you group fields on how they're going to be displayed, like all of the teaser fields are together. Or maybe you group the fields to match a legacy system. Like if you're having to copy things from a manufacturer's catalog for some piece of your content, you want to match the order so that people don't have to sort of jump back and forth across the forms. The organization of fields on the back end in basically every CMS that I know about doesn't have to match the display on the front end. So you can organize the back end however it makes most sense and is most helpful for the authors. And if you're putting guidelines in the CMS, you can also customize the author experience overall to make everything easier. And you only have to customize for your needs. You don't have to customize for anyone else's. So that might mean like having a calendar widget for choosing a date instead of like a proper sort of format with the slashes or the dashes or whatever. You might have default text so that authors only need to edit a few words. You might have select lists instead of text boxes. You might use autocomplete fields. All of the things that we do in normal form design for like front-end end user UX. We can do those on the back end too and improve the authoring experience. And then finally, when the help text is being displayed in context, there's never the wrong version, right? It's never like an old PDF version. So I don't know if any of you are knitters. I'm a knitter. I download most of my knitting patterns in PDF format. I got an update to one of them. I got an email saying there was an update to this pattern the other day. And I didn't download it because I've already knit that sweater, which I know is terrible because next time I knit it, I'm apparently going to knit like a hole into the medium size. But like I just don't download the new PDF because that's not what people do. You sort of do it only if you need it right now. So if we make sure that the information is in the CMS, then it's sort of the right, proper, updated, most current version all of the time. The downside to putting stuff in the CMS is that you need developer help to do it. This is not a bad thing inherently, but it can be a roadblock depending on how your organization is set up. Plenty of CMSs will actually let you enter the help text like in a WYSIWYG sort of web interface. So you might just need a developer to give you like a little bit of a tour and then you can sort of go on your own and do this. But in other CMSs, the help text has to be like written into the code. It needs legitimate developer resources and budget and scheduling and project management. And so that can be like a true roadblock. So you might be thinking like, thanks, Eileen, this is awesome. Next time I build my site from scratch, I will put this information right into the editor forms. But for now, over here in the real world, I already have a site and it doesn't have any of this stuff. And so what am I supposed to do? I think that when we're doing problem solving, there is a true value in understanding the ideal end state, even if we can't reach it right now, so that we make decisions that take us towards that. So what does that look like for content guidelines? Bare minimum, if you do nothing else, put a link to your content guidelines PDF at the top of your CMS editing screen. This will take developer resources, but literally like 15 minutes of developer resources. And this means that your authors will just have like at least, if nothing else, a really easy, quick, direct link to the content guidelines without having to search them out. It's not perfection, but it is progress. It is worth doing. If you can do a little bit more, ditch the PDF, get your guidelines into HTML. This looks pretty untenable, right? This like, can we even see this on this? Not really. There's a paper background here. It's a piece of like paper with like scribble marks on it. a PDF is frankly not any better than having a printed copy of your guidelines somewhere. It's not a tenable way to keep a living document. And it's really, really nice to know that anyone who looks at the guidelines is looking at the most updated version, which means we should have them in HTML in a single place. If you have an intranet, or a SharePoint, I'm sorry, you can keep your guidelines there. Or you can create a page in your CMS that only admins can see. It might be that you create a page that has special role permissions, or you might just create a page and leave it unpublished so that people who are logged in can follow the link to that page, but that no one on the front end can see it. Like, it's scrappy, it's hacky, but it works. And then finally, keep talking with your team. Check in regularly with them. Talk to designers and developers and see if there's something where they're like, we keep breaking this thing on the site and it's not working anymore. If there's a piece of the guidelines that needs a little bit of extra reminder, talk to your authors and editors. Are there snags in the process? Are they fields that they just quite don't understand yet? And then talk to QA, because they are often silently fixing stuff that we didn't even realize was broken, and they just keep fixing it quietly because that's their job. So I used to think that it was inevitable, that a few months after launch, I would be guaranteed that we would find like misused fields and confusing headlines, that particular kind of chaos that comes from combining a powerful CMS and an untrained site administrator. But as I've moved the content guidelines into the CMS itself, my post-launch check-ins have like way fewer annoyed sighs and many more places where I can find to make just like incremental improvements. When we embed the instructions where they're most relevant and helpful, we're actually teaching our authors good habits, and we're building confidence so that they can maintain and even expand a really complex site without feeling completely overwhelmed. A website that looks perfect on launch day is super satisfying and is beautiful, but when we improve the author experience, we're improving the content forever, and that's a whole lot more satisfying. Thank you.